September 15th, 1940, 11:47 a.m., 22,000 feet above the green fields of Kent. Pilot Officer Colin Gray had a Messerschmitt Bf 109 perfectly framed in his gun sight. 400 yards, closing fast. The German pilot was still blind to the danger. Gray's thumb rested on the firing button. 3 seconds. That was all it would take. Then the Messerschmitt's nose snapped downward into a sudden, steep dive. Gray reacted instantly. He shoved the control column forward and followed, the negative G yanking him up against his harness straps. The sky flipped. The ground rushed closer. And then, without warning, the Merlin coughed once and died. The propeller spun uselessly in the slipstream. The gun sight slid off target. 1,030 horsepower vanished in a heartbeat. Gray swore into his oxygen mask. He already knew the reason. Every RAF pilot did. The carburetor had flooded. Fuel starvation. 2 seconds, maybe 3. His Spitfire was no longer a fighter. It was a falling glider. Below him, the German pilot pulled out of the dive and disappeared into the cloud. He never looked back. He didn't need to. He knew the British aircraft couldn't follow. Moments later, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine staggered back to life, rough and uneven. Too late. Gray's 5th kill had escaped, not because of German flying skill, but because of British engineering. 20 minutes later, he landed at Biggin Hill. He filled out the same form he'd completed twice before. Engine cutout during negative G maneuver. Duration, 2.3 seconds. Enemy aircraft escaped. That report joined more than 2,300 others locked away inside filing cabinets at the Air Ministry. 2,300 recorded engine failures during the Battle of Britain. 2,300 moments when British pilots were helpless in the sky. Somewhere in that mountain of paperwork was the reason so many young men never came home. Finding the answer wasn't the problem. The problem was that no one could fix it. No one, except a woman working alone in a laboratory at Farnborough. A woman most of the RAF had never heard of. Her name was Beatrice Shilling, and she was about to break every rule in the system to save their lives. The flaw itself was brutally simple. The Merlin engine, the heart of every Spitfire and Hurricane, relied on an SU carburetor with a float chamber. In normal flight, gravity fed fuel smoothly into the engine. It worked flawlessly until combat began. In a dive, negative G hurled the fuel upward. The float dropped. The valve snapped open. Fuel flooded the system and drowned the supercharger. The engine died for 1 second, sometimes 2. Sometimes long enough for a Messerschmitt to circle back and rake your cockpit with cannon fire. The Germans had no such weakness. Their Daimler-Benz DB601 used direct fuel injection. No float chamber, no flooding. A Bf 109 pilot could roll inverted, dive vertically, hold negative G for 10 seconds straight, and his engine never missed a beat. Luftwaffe tacticians recognized the advantage within weeks. Their solution was devastatingly elegant. If a British fighter got on your tail, dive. The Spitfire would follow. Its engine would cut out. Then you escaped, or you turned and killed him while he was powerless. They called it the English disease, and they exploited it in every dogfight. Fighter Command knew the truth. They had known since 1937. Engineers at the Royal Aircraft Establishment had written reports, filed recommendations, proposed fixes. Nothing moved. The Air Ministry had other concerns: production schedules, budgets, debates over whether the problem was really as serious as claimed. While they argued, pilots kept dying. Then came the Battle of Britain. Between July and October 1940, RAF pilots recorded engine cutouts in 43% of diving attacks. 43%. Nearly half of every aggressive move ended with silence. From the engine, squadron commanders estimated that 80 to 100 pilots were killed directly because of the carburetor flaw. Men with German aircraft squarely in their sights, men who flew perfectly, men who died because their engines betrayed them at the exact moment they needed them most. Rolls-Royce was already working on a solution, a pressure carburetor, a full redesign, fuel injection principles similar to the German system, proper engineering, proper testing, estimated delivery, late 1943. The RAF didn't have 3 years. They didn't even have 3 months. Pilots were dying faster than replacements could be trained. Every week, experienced men were lost because of a fuel system designed for peacetime flying. In November 1940, the file landed on the desk of Beatrice Shilling, Principal Technical Officer, Carburetor Research and Development, the only female engineer at the Royal Aircraft Establishment. She read the combat reports, studied maintenance logs, interviewed pilots who had survived engine failures. It took her less than a week to understand the problem. Solving it would take 4 months. Testing it would risk her entire career. Shilling had never been expected to become an engineer. Born in 1909 in Waterlooville, Hampshire, the daughter of a butcher, her future had already been written by convention. Girls like her became clerks, nurses, shopkeepers. She refused that script. At 14, she bought a broken motorcycle with money earned from odd jobs. Her parents thought she wanted to ride it. She didn't. She tore the engine apart, piece by piece, learned what every component did, then rebuilt it on her bedroom floor, better than before. At 25, she raced that same motorcycle at Brooklands, hitting 106 miles per hour on the concrete banking. She earned the British Motorcycle Racing Club Gold Star, one of only 3 women ever to do so. Racing taught her what textbooks never could: how engines behave under stress, how they fail, how to feel a problem before instruments reveal it. Now she was the RAF's carburetor expert, and carburetors were killing pilots. The solution came in January 1941. Simple physics. If negative G caused too much fuel to surge forward, then fuel flow had to be restricted, not stopped, just controlled. Enough to feed the engine, not enough to flood it. A brass disc, a hole in the center, installed in the fuel line before the carburetor. Shilling machined the first prototype herself. She tested 17 different hole sizes, ran calculations, conducted simulations for 6 weeks. The optimal diameter, 0.04 inches. Bench tests were flawless. Engine cutouts shrank from seconds to a fraction of a heartbeat. Too brief to matter in combat. But bench tests weren't dogfights. To prove it worked, Shilling needed combat testing, and that was forbidden. Unauthorized modifications to RAF aircraft were a court-martial offense. The Air Ministry demanded 6 months of trials, committees, certifications, paperwork that would outlive the pilots it was meant to protect. Shilling had 6 brass restrictors and a choice: wait for permission, or save lives and accept the consequences. On March 17, 1941, she loaded her tools and restrictors onto her Norton motorcycle and rode 40 miles through the English countryside to RAF Biggin Hill. Morning patrols were forming. Ground crews swarmed across the airfield, fueling Spitfires and Hurricanes, loading ammunition, preparing men for combat. Shilling found the chief mechanic, a sergeant named Harris. 16 years working on Merlin engines, hands that knew every bolt by touch. She showed him the brass disc, explained the physics, told him the truth. No authorization, No paperwork, no command approval. Harris turned the restrictor over in his oil-stained fingers. Such a small thing. So simple. "How do you know it works?" he asked. "Bench tests," Shilling replied. 6 weeks. Perfect results. Bench tests aren't combat. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm here." Harris looked out across the flight line. Young pilots climbing into cockpits. Men trusting their engines with their lives. "I've lost 11 pilots to engine cutouts," he said quietly. 11 good men. He looked back at Shilling, then at the brass disc in his hand. Harris turned the small brass restrictor over in his hand, one last time. "If this thing works," he said quietly, "I don't care if the king himself hasn't authorized it." He picked up his welding kit and walked toward the nearest Spitfire. The aircraft belonged to Alan Deere, one of Fighter Command's most experienced pilots, a New Zealander. 54 combat missions, 7 confirmed kills. He'd been shot down twice, survived a mid-air collision, and walked away from a crash landing that should have ended his life. In the last 3 months alone, he had reported engine failure 4 times, every one of them during a diving attack. On the morning of March 17, 1941, his Spitfire became the first aircraft fitted with Shilling's restrictor. He was never told. If it failed, Shilling wanted the responsibility to be hers alone. Not the pilot's, not the squadron's, hers. Harris welded the restrictor into the fuel line in under 2 minutes, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. At 07:15, Deere climbed into the cockpit. A routine patrol. 2 hours over the channel. Watch for German formations. Nothing unusual. At the edge of the airfield, Beatrice Shilling stood perfectly still. Her heart was hammering. Her hands didn't shake. If the restrictor worked, Deere would never notice a thing. If it failed, if the fuel starved, if the weld cracked, if the hole was the wrong size, he would fall out of the sky, and she would spend the rest of her life knowing she had killed him. The Merlin roared to life. Deere taxied forward, released the brakes, accelerated. The Spitfire lifted cleanly from the runway and climbed into the gray English sky. Shilling watched until it shrank to a speck. Then she waited. Minutes stretched into hours. She paced the perimeter of the field, checked her watch again and again, calculated fuel burn in her head. 2 hours airborne, maybe 2.5 if the patrol was extended. Around her, the war carried on as normal. Mechanics worked, engines ran, aircraft came and went. For everyone else, it was an ordinary morning. For Shilling, it was everything. She had tested engines before, published papers, attended conferences, but she had never gambled a man's life on something that existed only because she believed in it. Belief wasn't proof, and if she was wrong, belief wouldn't bring Deere back. At the 1-hour mark, Harris found her and handed her a cup of tea. She took it, but didn't drink. Her stomach was too tight. "He's a good pilot," Harris said. "Best in the squadron. If anyone can test your gadget properly, it's him." She nodded. That was exactly why she'd chosen him. Aggressive, experienced, a man who wouldn't hesitate to push into a dive, a man who would find out quickly whether the restrictor worked or didn't. 90 minutes passed. The patrol should have been turning back. If everything had gone normally, if his engine hadn't failed over the channel, if he wasn't floating in the water right now, watching his Spitfire sink beneath the waves, if he wasn't already dead. 2 hours and 17 minutes after takeoff, a single aircraft appeared over the field. Shilling saw it first. She had been staring at the sky for so long her eyes ached. One Spitfire, No smoke, no damage. Deer landed smoothly, taxied to dispersal, shut down the engine, and climbed out of the cockpit. He was smiling. Pilots didn't smile after routine patrols. They looked exhausted, tight, relieved just to be alive. Deer looked like a man who had just discovered something extraordinary. Deer looked like a man who had uncovered a secret the enemy wasn't supposed to lose. Harris reached him first. "Any problems with the engine, sir?" Deer pulled off his helmet, still grinning. "Problems. That's the best the Merlin has ever run." Over the channel, he'd encountered two Messerschmitt BF 109s. They spotted him, turned to engage, and then did what German pilots always did when a Spitfire got too close. They dove. The standard escape tactic, the move that was supposed to leave the British fighter helpless. Deer followed. Stick forward, full -G. The dive that should have killed his engine. The Merlin never even hesitated. Full power all the way down. Deer closed to 150 yards before the German pilots realized something was wrong. He fired. Pieces flew off one Messerschmitt's tail. The aircraft limped toward France, trailing smoke. It was the first confirmed damage Deer had scored in a diving attack since August. "I don't know what maintenance did to this aircraft," he said evenly, "but I want it done to every Spitfire in the squadron." Harris glanced at Beatrice Shilling. Shilling looked down at the ground. "I think that can be arranged, sir," Harris replied. Word spread through Fighter Command like wildfire. Within 48 hours, Biggin Hill had fitted restrictors to every aircraft on the field. Pilots reported flawless engine performance. Dives that once ended in silence now ended in kills. Phones rang across southern England. Squadron commanders from RAF Hornchurch, RAF Kenley, RAF Tangmere, RAF Northolt, and Manston all asked the same question. What did Biggin Hill do to its engines, and how fast could they get it? The Air Ministry found out within a week. Shilling braced for the storm. Court-martial threats. Career-ending fury. Instead, the phone rang. It was Keith Park, commander of No. 11 Group, the man responsible for defending London and southeast England. "Miss Shilling," he said, "I've read the combat reports from Biggin Hill. I'm told you're responsible." "Yes, sir," she replied. "How fast can you install this device in every aircraft in Fighter Command?" She hesitated. "Sir, you heard me. How fast?" She did the calculations in her head. 43 stations, nearly 3,000 engines, training crews, prioritizing frontline squadrons, working day and night. 6 weeks, she said. Maybe 5, if Rolls-Royce can produce the parts quickly enough. "You have 4, Park replied. "I'll handle the authorization. You handle the installation. Don't let me down." Shilling assembled a team of 3 engineers and mounted her Norton motorcycle once more. Biggin Hill was only the beginning, then Hornchurch, Kenley, Tangmere, Northolt, Manston, Hawkinge, Gravesend. 43 stations in 4 weeks. She planned the route like a campaign. Frontline squadrons first. No delays, no excuses. At every base, she trained ground crews personally, demonstrated the installation, supervised the first fittings, inspected every weld, measured every hole. Any restrictor that didn't meet her standard was rejected on the spot. She slept in hangars when there was time to sleep. She ate sandwiches balanced on her motorcycle when there was no time to stop. She rode through cold spring rain, through exhaustion, and sometimes through the distant thunder of German bombs falling nearby. The work did not slow. Some stations welcomed her openly. At RAF Hornchurch, pilots lined up to shake her hand, After their first successful diving attacks, with the restrictor fitted, they didn't need explanations. They could feel the difference in the air. Other stations were less certain. A woman giving orders to their mechanics, a civilian telling RAF personnel how to modify combat aircraft. At one base, a wing commander flatly refused, told her to return when she had proper paperwork from the Air Ministry. Shilling said nothing. She simply produced Keith Park's direct authorization. The wing commander went pale. The installation began immediately. At another station, a young pilot asked her what she had done to deserve such an important role. "I'm good at it," she replied. He considered that for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough. By April 20th, every Spitfire and Hurricane in Fighter Command had been modified. 2,347 Merlin engines. 4 weeks of relentless work. The device needed an official name. The Royal Aircraft Establishment called it the Ray Restrictor. The pilots chose something else. Stanley Hooker, chief engineer at Rolls-Royce, gave it the nickname that stuck: Miss Shilling's Orifice. Crude RAF humor. Shilling didn't mind. If a dirty joke helped pilots remember what kept them alive, she was happy to accept it. The results were immediate and undeniable. Fighter Command tracked everything, every sortie, every engagement, every loss. In March 1941, before the restrictor, engine cutouts occurred in 41% of diving attacks. The kill-to-loss ratio stood at 1.4 to 1. 51 British fighters lost, 73 German aircraft destroyed. In April 1941, after the restrictor, engine cutouts dropped to 3%. The kill-to-loss ratio surged to 3.1 to 1. 27 British fighters lost, 84 German aircraft destroyed. The change was instant, measurable, irrefutable. Pilot confidence transformed overnight. Men who once hesitated at the top of a dive now committed without a second thought. Robert Stanford Tuck, one of the RAF's top aces, described it in a letter home. "It's like flying a different aircraft. Before, every dive was a gamble. You'd hesitate for just a moment, and that moment could kill you. Now there's no hesitation. The Merlin runs perfectly. I can finally fight the way I always wanted to." Johnny Johnson, who would become the RAF's highest-scoring ace, flew his first combat missions that same month. "The older pilots warned me about diving," he later recalled. "They said the engine might quit. The older pilots warned me about diving," he later recalled. "They said the engine might quit. By the time I started flying, that problem was gone. Miss Shilling had fixed it. I never thought twice about diving on a German. That probably saved my life a dozen times." And Douglas Bader, the legendary ace who flew with 2 artificial legs, summed it up bluntly. "Before Shilling, we fought defensively. We were afraid of our own engines. After Shilling, we fought the way fighter pilots are supposed to fight. Aggressive, committed, no hesitation." She gave them their confidence back. Alan Deere, the same pilot who had unknowingly flown the first combat test of the restrictor, became one of its strongest supporters. Weeks later, when he finally learned what had been done to his aircraft, his reaction was not in anger. "I didn't know I was the guinea pig until much later," he wrote in his memoirs. "When Miss Shilling explained what she'd done, I was grateful. She took a risk on me so thousands of other pilots wouldn't have to take the same risk. That takes courage." The enemy noticed, too. Within weeks, Luftwaffe intelligence reports began to note something alarming. British fighters were no longer breaking off dives. The old German escape tactic wasn't working anymore. By May 1941, Luftwaffe tactical manuals quietly removed the section on exploiting British engine failures. The English disease was gone. It had been cured by a woman, a brass washer, and the courage to ignore the rule book. The restrictor remained in frontline service until 1943. That year, Rolls-Royce finally delivered the pressure carburetor, the proper long-term engineering fix. Fuel injection principles, no float chamber, no flooding, but retrofitting existing aircraft took 8 hours per engine. Fighter Command couldn't afford to ground squadrons for that long, so the restrictors stayed. Many aircraft flew with Miss Shilling's orifice until 1944. Some kept it until the very end of the war. Pilots trusted it. Ground crews knew it by heart. The device cost less than £1 to manufacture. A single brass washer kept pilots alive for 4 critical years. Shilling didn't stop there. The Royal Aircraft Establishment had no shortage of lethal problems, and she tackled them one by one. When Spitfires were sent to Russia, she addressed cold start failures in Arctic conditions near Murmansk. At -40 degrees, fuel lines froze solid. Batteries died within hours. Oil turned to sludge. Pilots couldn't even start their engines. Shilling devised a cold start system using preheated oil and modified fuel mixtures. She wrote instructions simple enough for Soviet ground crews, many of whom had never seen a Merlin engine before. Spitfires flew combat missions through the brutal winter because of it. Later, she focused on high-altitude performance. Late-war Spitfires were climbing to 35,000 feet, hunting German reconnaissance aircraft and high-altitude bombers. Up there, air was thin, oxygen was scarce, fuel mixtures had to be exact. Too rich and the engine flooded, too lean and it overheated. Shilling developed altitude-compensating modifications that boosted power output by 8% above 30,000 feet. Test pilots reported better climb rates, sharper handling, better chances of catching enemies who thought altitude made them untouchable. By 1945, she had completed 17 major projects at Farnborough: cold weather systems, carburetor improvements, supercharger efficiency, high-altitude modifications. Each one saved lives. None ever matched the fame of the restrictor. She had married George Naylor in 1938, a mathematician at the RAE. During the war, he flew bombers with No. 625 Squadron, completing 31 missions over Germany. Bomber Command had the highest casualty rate of any RAF branch. 1 in 2 aircrew didn't survive. Every time Naylor took off, the odds said he might not return. Shilling understood those odds better than most. She calculated probabilities for a living. She knew exactly how thin the line was between life and death at 20,000 feet over enemy territory. Against the statistics, George Naylor came home. He came home in 1944. They never spoke about what he had seen. He never asked about her work. Some things they both understood were better left unspoken. In 1948, Beatrice Shilling was appointed an officer of the Order of the British Empire by George VI. She went to Buckingham Palace, accepted the medal, stood for photographs beside the king. A reporter asked her what the secret to her success was. "Solving problems," she said. "That's all engineering is. Someone has a problem. You find a solution. You make it work." When asked whether being a woman had made her career more difficult, she shrugged. She said she hadn't had time to think about that. She'd been too busy being an engineer. The next morning, she was back at Farnborough, working on jet engine problems. She never rose to director-level positions. Those roles were quietly reserved for men. Unwritten rules that no one admitted existed, but everyone obeyed. She never complained. She preferred real engineering to meetings and paperwork. After the war, she worked on Britain's Blue Streak missile program, then turned her attention to a new killer. By the 1950s, wet runway braking accidents were claiming more pilots than engine failures. Shilling published technical papers explaining how water affected tire friction, dry equations that saved lives on rain-soaked airfields. She even helped design a bobsled for the RAF Olympic team, an odd assignment for an aeronautical engineer until you considered the principles involved: aerodynamics, weight distribution, friction, the same problems she had solved her entire life. The team didn't win medals, but they didn't crash either. In bobsledding, that counts. In 1967, racing legend Dan Gurney faced an overheating problem with his Eagle Mk1 Formula One car. His engineers couldn't solve it. Someone suggested calling the woman who had fixed the Spitfires during the war. Shilling was 58. She studied the cooling system for 2 hours, asked questions, took measurements, ran calculations. Then she found the answer. Engineers half her age, armed with elite degrees, hadn't seen it. She solved it in an afternoon. "It's the same as any other engine problem," she told them. "You understand the physics. You find the simplest solution. You make it work." She retired in 1969. Her final years mirrored her first, working on motorcycles, restoring vintage machines, racing at classic events, maintaining the Norton She-D, owned since she was 14, the machine that had taught her how engines behave under stress. She died on November 18, 1990, at the age of 81. The obituaries focused on one thing: the brass washer, Miss Shilling's orifice. Everything else was reduced to footnotes. Today, a pub in Farnborough bears her name. Brooklands displays her racing trophies. Universities have buildings named in her honor. Engineering schools still teach her restrictor as a case study. Simple solution, immediate action, measurable results. But the real lesson was never about engineering. It was about courage. In March 1941, Beatrice Shilling faced a choice. She could follow procedure, wait for authorization, file paperwork, sit through committee meetings while pilots kept dying. Or she could load a motorcycle with brass washers and fix the problem herself. She chose to act. She risked her career, her reputation, possibly her freedom. She installed an unauthorized modification in a combat aircraft and sent a pilot into battle without telling him. If she had been wrong, she would have been court-martialed, disgraced, destroyed. She wasn't wrong. Thousands of pilots came home because of her decision. Thousands of families stayed whole. Thousands of lives were lived instead of carved into stone. One woman, one motorcycle, one brass washer with a hole in it, and the courage to act while everyone else waited for permission. That is how history changes.